Welcome everyone to our virtual webinar panel discussion. We're going to be covering the topic, looking forward, how companies are future-proofing the supply chain. We want to thank all of you today for joining from across the US and even some from around the world. My name is Axis Rutledge, and I will be moderating this insightful discussion that we have planned today. Just a little bit about me. I am the head of our West Coast procurement and supply chain recruitment at DSJ Global. I joined DSJ Global about 4 years ago in our New York office and specialized within the procurement function for the life sciences industry. Last year, I took the opportunity to help launch our 7th US office in LA and to better support our clients and candidates on the West Coast in securing both supply chain and procurement talent across all industries. I'm so excited to be here today and moderate this insightful discussion with our expert panelists. I know we have many clients with us here today, but for those of you who don't already know about DSJ Global, we are a leading global recruitment agency specializing in end-to-end supply chain. We were founded in 2008, and we help clients from innovative startups to Fortune 500 companies solve one of their top challenges, which is attracting and securing industry-leading talent. Today, we provide permanent, contract, and multi-hire recruitment solutions across supply chain, procurement, technical operations, and logistics all around the world. Our role as a recruiter is to find the talent that you need so that your business can keep moving forward. Now to the exciting part. What is on the agenda for today's discussion? We will first start with an introduction on the expert panelists we have with us today, and we will cover some of DSJ Global's research on the topic at hand. We will then look at the disruptions affecting global supply chains, and specifically the panelists will talk about their own experiences and impacts on their organization from these disruptions. This will then lead us to adapting to those external factors. So what solutions were used by our panelists to help combat these disruptions? We will next cover how to create a resilient supply chain, as it is crucial to future-proofing your business. Our panelists will discuss strategies from our research that they implemented to help protect their organization. Lastly, as we are a recruitment firm, we always like to bring it back to talent. With all of these disruptions, do companies have the talent they need in order to protect their business? Our panelists will discuss the current hiring landscape in supply chain, particularly for their organization, and some new skill sets that are now in demand. There wouldn't be a webinar without a Q&A session, so please submit any questions you have in the Zoom chat, and we'll try and cover as many as we can at the end. Now to introduce our expert panelists. Joining from Charlotte, North Carolina, we have Jonathan Eaton, who is the Principal National Supply Chain Practice Leader at Grant Thornton. He has over 26 years of supply chain experience, and he is recognized for his ability to help clients define their supply chain strategy in response to changing market conditions and other disruptive forces. So happy to have you here, Jonathan. Next, we have Scott DiCarlo, who joins us from New York, who is currently the Vice President of Supply Chain for IPC North America, a franchisee-owned supply chain company supporting Subway, home of the $5 footlong, restaurants in the US, Canada, and Puerto Rico. Over the course of Scott's career, he has spent time focused on go-to-market supply chain activities, which include customer-facing roles, strategy development and implementation, and operational excellence initiatives with a focus on plan, source, and deliver. Hey, Scott. Finally, we have our last panelist, Kevin Knoll, who joins us from New York and is the Vice President of Global Supply Chain at Aterian. He is best known as a multi-channel CPG supply chain executive with world-class experience, building and growing industry-leading national supply chains and domestic fulfillment to support 1 to 2 day delivery to end customers. Hey, hello, Kevin. We'd like to thank all of our panelists for taking time out of their schedules to be here virtually with us today. Before we kick off the discussion, we would like to give some background on a white paper we rolled out about a month ago to our network of clients and candidates, which forms the basis of today's discussion. This piece covers research on strategies and solutions to combat disruptions in the industry and how companies can build a resilient supply chain. DSJ Global has been helping clients navigate these challenging last 18 months when it comes to their actual supply chain and talent acquisition to prepare them for the future. Today's webinar will dive deeper into these strategies and how our panelists are making an impact in their organization and the wider industry. Now to begin the discussion with our first topic. As we have all seen, headline news has been dominated by stories of global supply chain disruptions over the last year. from COVID-19 leading to toilet paper shortages to ships being blocked in the Suez Canal. So posing the questions to our panelists, how have these disruptions or others impacted your organization? Kevin, would you like to go first?
Sure. Thank you, Axis. Appreciate DSJ and your team coordinating this, and also for Ross Williams for also working with us in the past. So kudos out to you guys. This disruption, it's been challenging for everyone. When it first started, I don't think any of us thought the magnitude of the reverberations in terms of the global supply chain would, be at this level. And then as we go into the peak season holiday of this year, what are we expecting? So, those are all big questions that are out there. A lot of analysts, financial companies, et cetera, supply chain companies are trying to solve that question. So in terms of the impact, the pandemic and also the supply chain shortages, the Suez Canal incident really didn't impact us that much. But, for us, all segments of our supply chain were impacted, including the ocean freight forwarding, the shortage of containers, the blank sailings, the capacity issue with vessels, that's reverberated from the traffic coming from China and Far East to the US and vice versa. Once the products get into the US, the drayage, moving the goods from the port to the warehouses all across the US, be it West, East, or Central, all of that has been impacted. Shortages, the cost per drayage and transportation has gone up significantly. We've seen anywhere from 2x to 4x to even 5x increases in a lot of the segments of our supply chain. Warehousing, with the pandemic, shortage of labor, hourly rates are going up. And a lot of it, especially with the pandemic, people are working from home. They're purchasing items off of platforms like Amazon. They still expect that 1 to 2 day delivery. So that requires these warehouses to operate at a very peak-like condition level, even during non-peak months. So that also translates into additional costs and supply chain challenges. Movement of goods between warehouses, the full truckload movement of goods between warehouses for inventory balancing. The rates for over-the-road transport has gone up significantly. A lot of shortages, a lot of drivers in need, shortage of equipment. And then, of course, the one that hurts a lot of the consumer CPG companies like us in terms of delivering to the end customer is the last mile. Our partners like FedEx and UPS have increased rates significantly. Big surcharges for additional handling, large package surcharges, all those translate into SKU margin erosion and additional costs to customers. So just going back to the disruptions, it's been end to end, everything from the factories in overseas, for example, in China, all the way to that end customer. Every segment of that supply chain has been impacted by what's been happening in the last year and a half.
Great. No, awesome. That's great and awesome. I guess, Scott, do you have anything different that you've seen from your industry specifically?
Yeah, and hi everybody. Good afternoon. Thanks for having me here to join you. Yeah, Kevin's spot on with everything that's going on in the industry right now. We're all dealing with this, and I think it's going to be like this for some period of time. QSR is a little more resilient than some other industries in going through this because even with worker shortages and the like, restaurants are still open, right? People are looking for takeouts. We've been lucky enough that we've had volume behind us to at least help us not have such a steep COVID down and such a big COVID up that some of the other industries are having to deal with. That being said, I think there's probably two different impacts aside from what Kevin's mentioned already that I would see as positives in this space. So the first one is that everybody knows who supply chain is now. I've never seen supply chain on the news more than it is today. So you feel a little bit like a celebrity, even though it's not as positive as it is, but it gives people an appreciation for the disturbances and the force that we've been dealing with for years, right? So supply chains are always problem solving. It just maybe hasn't been this many things happening all at one time. So we support 25,000 restaurants in US, Canada, and Puerto Rico. So that's no small feat. The majority of them have reopened since the pandemic has happened. And we're dealing with the same issues that everybody's dealing with. That last mile piece that Kevin brings up tied with the worker shortages that we're seeing happen at distributors, at suppliers, means we have to get really creative with getting the product in place for a consumer to purchase it. And that might mean a limited menu at times. It may not be every offering that you're looking for, but at least if we can keep the restaurants open, that's our goal in all of this. The second biggest impact, though, I think is it created a playbook for us, right? We're different organizations than we were a year ago. We know how to deal with a lot of these situations. So we kind of have the recipe book now, that God forbid, if this were to happen again, we can figure out ways to solve it and shortcut some of these issues. So for us in particular, it's caused us to look at domestic supply versus import supply for some of our non-perishable items, and taking distributor off the shelf product in some instances, just so we can keep restaurants in stock.
Cool. That's insightful from the restaurant industry. Jonathan, have you had anything different that you've seen just from supporting like a variety of your clients?
Yeah, thanks, Axis, for the question, and great, great points from Kevin and Scott as well. I would share a couple of thoughts. COVID-19 and the Suez Canal issue, the blockage there, supply shortages are really, I think, three of the more current issues that we've seen. But if you think about supply chain disruption, historically, if we go all the way back to the Fukushima nuclear reactor issue, that was a problem. Then we had the issue with SolarWinds breach, which was more of a cyber issue, but that could infect trading partners up and down within the supply chain. Most recently, we had the Colonial Pipeline issue. We've had Brexit along the way. And I think the common theme here, when I look at this with many of the clients that we serve, is that disruption is a reality. And I think they recognize that. And a lot of the clients that we talk to will say, well, they're black swan events. And by definition, a black swan event is something that's very unusual and that you can't plan for. And I think while that may be true, the reality is it's really not a good excuse, the fact that it's a black swan event for failing to plan, because failing to plan is planning to fail. And so I think what we've seen with regard to disruption and how they've impacted organizations, Kevin and Scott have covered a number of those things, but I think what's important is to understand the entire supply chain ecosystem within which an organization lives, and to be able to identify risk factors. And while you certainly would not have been able to have prepared for, say, a national lockdown and some of the impacts of COVID, for example, you certainly could prepare for the likelihood of changes in channel. In terms of the product, the channels that you sell products through, as an example, that would be one thing. And I've seen a number of companies be impacted by that. If we think about just impacts, changes in the channel through which products are sold has been a big factor. I think lead times clearly, and I think that was mentioned previously, but lead times are at an all-time high. The availability of raw materials is challenging, and we're going to get to labor availability later, so I'll save that for a bit. I think planning, though, it really comes back to planning, and I think a good business continuity plan is one of the things that probably would have benefited companies and that was missing. And so if I look at how they were impacted, I think the impact was frankly more of an exposure of a lack of business continuity planning, an approach for supply chain resiliency, and executive commitment to that, and so forth. And so I think those things were ultimately a part of what happened. And then we've seen organizations that have struggled, financially from a liquidity perspective, because they didn't have sufficient cash to weather the storm, if you will, in terms of the impact that was created by the disruption. And so those are just a few examples. I'm really anxious to get to the next question and talk about, some of the things that companies are doing to try to combat this, as well as strategies for that. But those are my comments on a few of the disruptions, Axis.
Oh, awesome. And that's interesting to hear that you're seeing similar impacts across your clients too. Just like as Scott mentioned, I think it's hard to find any organization that has not been impacted by COVID or these disruptions. So thank you all for sharing those there. Moving on to the next question. Now with these disruptions in the industry, supply chain leaders are tasked to find solutions to combat these external factors and protect their business. From your experiences, what solutions were implemented by your organization to combat these disruptions? Scott, would you like to start us off?
Yeah, absolutely. So, flexible and agile supply chains don't happen by accident, right? They're by design, and it takes a long time to be able to build in the adaptability that you need to be able to be resilient in some times like this, right? So I'm going to go back to that playbook that I mentioned earlier, where we weren't as flexible and agile as we needed to be, we are now, right? And that playbook's going to help us, and we can apply that day in and day out, as well as if there's another disruption that comes down the pike. So in particular, I'll focus on logistics here for a second, because I think that's one where it certainly has helped us quite a bit. Carriers and drivers like predictability, much like a lot of us do. But especially during a pandemic, knowing that they have volume guaranteed on certain lanes, for a duration of time helps them just be more predictable with the staffing they do have, especially when you have the pressures you're having right now and the driver shortage that we're continuing to be faced with, right? And just the variance in number of loads versus number of assets and drivers that are available. So we made a calculated decision last year to actually move the majority of our high volume lanes to asset-based carriers as opposed to brokerage business. That's protected us tremendously because those asset-based carriers have drivers on a payroll that they're looking to give that volume to. So we're using the variability in our supply chain for our broker business. That way, any of those spikes, they can handle that for us along the way. But we have much more predictability across all of our key lanes, thanks to making that shift. And that's one that's pandemic proof. It should be resilient against anything else that we face in the near future. And it's got some benefits in terms of generating savings as well, just because of economies of scale and the ability to create some backhauls.
Cool. Very interesting to hear that your team already had a solution in place to protect from the driver shortage by making the decision earlier and to increase the majority of your key lanes to asset-based carriers. Kevin, can you share with us some solutions that you have put into effect at your organization?
Sure. Just piggybacking off the things that Jonathan and Scott also mentioned, Aterian is very unique in that, we're a top CPG company that sells on Amazon and other e-commerce platform. We're a top seller on Amazon. We have some big brands such as Home Labs, Remy, Mueller, et cetera. So in this marketplace, the data is key, in terms of being able to have real-time data to make real-time decision-making. And that's where we benefit in that our Amy software, which is an artificial intelligence marketplace e-commerce engine, is able to capture real-time data in terms of transactions, supply chain, sales, product ideation, everything that is needed to run end-to-end supply chain and have data a few clicks away. A lot of companies, they would die for this kind of asset or visibility, but by having that kind of information, what we're able to do is pivot very quickly under conditions such as this. So some of the key things that we've done this year is build a lot of redundancy into our supply chain. I think Jonathan mentioned this earlier. Back when I was an industrial engineering student in grad school, I learned about reliability engineering, building networks that have redundancy. And if you look at a supply chain, it's very similar. As we partner with different companies, we may in some cases get a really good rate for one segment of supply chain, and we partner with one company. But guess what? If they run out of capacity or they have issues during a situation such as this, then we're in a very bad situation. So part of what we've been able to do at Aterian is partner with multiple asset and non-asset companies throughout our entire segment, all the segments of our supply chain. So we have opportunities to switch over, failover, just like in a circuit design, if you're looking at it from like electrical engineering standpoint. But apply that to a network, a supply chain network, which is also a very complex network. The other things that Aterian has is, we have over a dozen warehouses in our fulfillment center network that allows us to do 1 to 2 day delivery all across the U.S. for Amazon customers. That is a very powerful asset in a situation such as this. If you have severe port congestions and can't get containers into one part of the country, with that many warehouses, we're able to now fail over or switch over to another port, another part of the country, and then transport those goods to the locations from which we could deliver to the customer in 1 to 2 days. So, those types of opportunities are there, but it's the data that opens it. Without that data, we would still be flying blind, and that's a big part of it. In terms of sales and operations planning, that's another part of our function here. Is the folks I mentioned earlier, we have to work very closely with manufacturers overseas, and also take into consideration, like Jonathan mentioned, the lead time and other challenges that are associated with it. So once again, it goes back to the data. Our real-time data shows us what what we're selling, when, what the margin is, what we need to reorder. All those are key things that helps us become resilient in this environment.
Awesome. And the 1 to 2 day delivery is great, because I know even just moving during the period of COVID, it sometimes took like over a month to 2 months even to get like furniture or simple like plates delivered. So that's awesome that your organization was able to impact that. Jonathan, what have you seen just like supporting your various clients and everything from your angle?
Yeah, thank you. Great comments from Scott and Kevin, and I'll just add to that. I think improved collaboration, both upstream and downstream. So if we think about extending the supply chain, if you will, and really understanding who your suppliers are and who their suppliers, your secondary and tertiary suppliers, and where products are coming from, where raw materials, intermediates, whatever you're procuring, where those things originate. And identifying, where might risk exist and where would we potentially have issues as a company with being able to even make the products that we serve to companies. I think that upstream collaboration with suppliers is critical, and I think that the downstream aspect of it as well from a customer perspective. We all remember probably 20 years ago all of the conversation around CP/FAR, collaborative planning, forecasting, and replenishment. That came back to life in a big way. I think the collaborative mindset that I saw exist between many companies and their customers was helpful. And I think in some cases, our clients who are customers of others, which would be their supplier, if you will, if you think about it in that context, were proactive in trying to reach out and share forecasts for products. And if there was a manufacturing constraint, say because of a shelter-in-place order in a particular area that impacted a company, they wanted to know that and be able to identify and say, hey, if you have limited capacity to manufacture, here's the products that are most important to us. And so I think that level of communication and collaboration was good to see. We did see a number of companies start to search for new suppliers. I think a lot of that was driven either by risk or failure. We talked to so many organizations who had supplier failures. It was actually scary to see. And when we get to the next question, I'm going to talk about some of the strategies specifically as it relates to supply chain risk management. But I think the symptoms, the cause and effect, if you will, the effect was many companies were starting to look for new suppliers. The cause being failure of their existing suppliers. So I think that was a big one. We also saw a tighter focus on the trade payables equation, actually the cash conversion cycle in general. If we think about, cash cycle days, which is very simply days sales outstanding plus days of inventory on hand minus days of payable outstanding, that's how many days, when you do that math, that it takes a business to cycle cash through their business. Through and convert that. And so obviously you want to convert cash as quickly as possible. And so, companies were clearly focused on inventory. They always are. But I think the focus on days of sales outstanding and days payable outstanding were significant. And what they were doing was trying to ensure, look at their, risk rate, if you will, their receivables, and identify customers that may have had issues with payment and so forth, and take appropriate action. And we also saw them start to push payables out with their suppliers. We would never encourage that. I frankly think that's bad business to extend payables, but that's certainly something that we saw companies do. And we saw a lot of a bigger emphasis on cash flow forecasting and trying to specify and say, here's what our business is going to look like. And I feel like that was important for near-term funding. Many companies were in, they had weak balance sheets or were in a tough position because the top line revenues weren't there, and so they needed to draw down on their revolver to improve their working capital position. And so we saw a lot of companies doing that. So those are a few of the things that I would add to what Scott and Kevin shared. Axis.
Awesome. Thanks, Jonathan. Now, after implementing solutions for the real-time problems and disruptions, leaders must now make sure that they have contingency plans in place to avoid disruption to their supply chain in the future. As mentioned before, our white paper covers research on strategies that leaders can use to create a resilient supply chain. Some include taking action, innovating out of a crisis through digital transformation, becoming less efficient by diversifying your suppliers, preparing for the end of globalization, and creating a transparent supply chain. We would like to know what strategies has your organization used to create a more resilient supply chain. Kevin, would you like to start off?
Sure, thanks, Axis. I want to go back to the concept of building redundancy, kind of the reliability engineering approach to things, and give some real examples. from our experience. So, there's two segments. There's, the physical supply chain that a lot of us are very aware of, but then there's a technology component. We're not operating like, 50, 60, 70 years ago where everything's on paper. Data, the flow of goods this way and the flow of data this way and that way must be real time in order to, kind of benefit. So part of what at Aterian, we're a technology company. So, that's one of the core competencies that allows us to kind of innovate outside the box and not think in terms of, silos, because this is the way supply chain has worked in the past. So I'll give a few examples. Last year, before the pandemic, we worked with one large freight forwarder, and they did great business for us. The shipping was good, price was right, et cetera. But with the pandemic and the shortages and the capacity constraints for ocean freight forwarding, what we were able to do early is to start building relationships with other freight forwarders. So now we have multiple redundancies, depending on east, west, central. And what we've been able to do is still maintain our TEU volume without impacting price, as much as if we had stuck with a few carriers from the very beginning. So what that allows us to do, as factories produce goods and factory rated dates change, and now we're kind of playing musical chairs, right? Which freight forwarder has which capacity out of which port. By having a lot of redundancy and having had the tech integration and data exchange in place at the beginning, allows us to now make pivots and quickly decide, okay, well, the East Coast may not, or the West Coast may not be, viable for us for this month. What options do we have in Central and East? And then very quickly switch over to different carriers and make that happen. So we've been, very successful at getting goods into the country and then making those available to sell on Amazon, within this pandemic time. So that's one part of it. The other part is, we also built an international workforce. We talked about people. It's a global supply chain. In a lot of cases, I have people living in other countries as part of our international supply chain team that's managing U.S. operations. That's something that is possible now with real time and a platform from which we could see real data and then make decision making in terms of the supply chain. The other key part of it is the customer focus. Because we sell so much on Amazon, and as everyone knows, it's a really high bar to be successful, especially for a seller like us who's part of that fulfilled by merchant seller fulfilled prime networks. We have very high standards in terms of what we can perform to, which is very similar to the Amazon standards. So being in that environment, having to ship 6 days a week, having a very high on-time delivery requirement has actually, it's tough. It's one of those things that a lot of companies are successful in, but having worked up over the years to that level, it allows us to be successful in this environment because we're operating at a level much higher than some of the other companies. So when the pandemic happened and these inefficiencies happened, we were able to pivot very quickly. And then just real quickly, having multiple warehouses is very important. It's complexity wise, it's very easy to just have one central, one east, and one west. But when you got 12 warehouses, you've got redundancies everywhere. So it's more to manage, but it really gives you a lot of redundancy in this environment. And then, the other pieces is transportation, having multiple carriers, very similar to ocean freight forwarding, having a lot built of partnerships prior, and then have built tech integration. So that allows us to now pivot very quickly and make, shift volume from one carrier to another without having any quality issues is also important.
Awesome. Thanks, Kevin. Definitely interesting to hear your insights on managing the big data in real time to optimize your supply chain. Jonathan, have you seen anything different from your angle or anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, a number of things. This is my favorite question because I think this is where the rubber meets the road, if you will, as we start talking about strategies and what can you do to be resilient and have a better outcome next time. I think there's so many things. I think customer segmentation and SKU rationalization is one of the first. And I think the reason customer segmentation is important is I see companies day in and day out make the same mistake, is that they treat every customer as the same. And the truth of the matter is that they're not. Every customer has a different revenue profile, a different profile in terms of the margin that it generates and the inventory investment that's required to service that particular company. And so I think segmenting the customer base and determining who your critical customers are and how you're going to service them and what your service level agreements are going to be is a good place to start. SKU rationalization is essential. We've seen numerous reports from Coca-Cola, Kimberly-Clark, Kraft, others, many companies that are starting to focus on the concept of just what I call business simplification. I can remember, I'm in Charlotte now. I grew up in Tennessee, and I can remember being there 30 years ago growing up, and you would go into the supermarket and there would be, 5, 6, 7 types of bread. You go into the supermarket now and there's 105 or 6. And what you have there is demand cannibalization, and also additional cost. And so I think companies are starting to wise up and get smart about eliminating other SKUs that cannibalize demand for the things that frankly would probably sell more if there weren't so many combinations. And so I think that's one. A deeper analysis of supply chain cost to serve is essential. I looked at some statistics the other day on Amazon, and over an 11-year period, their supply chain cost to serve as a percent of net sales went up 10 cents on every dollar. So that's 10 cents of every dollar that was profit, which is now cost. If you've been in the Amazon facilities, which I have, you know that they have the absolute best automation and technology and capabilities in the world, and yet they still struggle. And so that tells me that many other companies are struggling on cost to serve as well. And so I think intertwined with customer segmentation and SKU rationalization is a need for a more in-depth view of cost to serve. And then that obviously impacts order fulfillment models. So do you ship same day for every customer, or do you have different minimum order quantities for every customer? Or do you ship once a week as opposed to multiple times a week for a customer? All of those things get into cost to serve and have to be tied back to the profitability of each customer relationship and the products that they buy. I think dynamic pricing is a part of that. We're seeing a number of companies start to, especially those that have a commodity base in the products that they sell, they're starting to use variable pricing models, or very simply dynamic models as opposed to static. The emphasis on supply chain risk management is huge. There are a couple of software solutions out there that we really like that are very effective at looking at data and identifying who those secondary and tertiary suppliers are that are in your network. Each company certainly knows who they buy from, but what they likely don't know is if you go a step further, or even 2 or 3 steps further, who's in their network that they don't know about. And so you start thinking about things like the SolarWinds breach, Colonial Pipeline, the issue with the JBS, the meat company. You start thinking about those things, and if you are doing online collaboration with those companies, or if you have trading partners who are, how easily your infrastructure could be affected. And so I think understanding who your supplier is from a supply chain risk management perspective is critical. And then I would say also, as it relates to President Biden's executive order on supply chains, the 100-day reports came out a couple of weeks ago, and it's a 250-page document that talks about over the course of the next year what they're going to be doing and looking at. And I think companies would certainly be wise to think about how that impacts them. Smart money always moves first. And I think depending on the industry that you're in, the chance of being impacted by either new legislation or new incentives, tax incentives, credits, whatever the case may be, those things are going to happen. I mean, if I go back before the election, just in pharma alone, there were 8 to 10 bills that were pending. And I think that's one example. We already know that there are automotive lines that are at a standstill because of semiconductor issues. And I think we're going to continue to see more of that in other industry sectors. And so I think really thinking about what potential changes from either a legislative or tax perspective may mean to your business, would be essential. And then I think just other actions. I talked about the cash conversion cycle earlier. I think, from a strategy perspective, you always want to be that company that's trying to improve cash conversion and strengthen the balance sheet. And I think, certainly focusing on supply chain risk, like I spoke about earlier, if you do that, you're going to reward your customers and keep them satisfied while building brand equity and building shareholder value.
Awesome. Thanks, Jonathan. Scott, have you implemented anything specifically at IPC that you've seen resulted in a different result, or any different challenges that you guys faced?
Yeah. A lot of it's similar to what Jonathan and Kevin hit on already, so I'll try not to be redundant here. But I'll also try to make it a little more generic, so that way it's applicable to everybody who's listening in today. So I think the key for us was accelerating the supply chain strategy we were already putting in place. We had built a 5-year plan that was focused on 3 different components: people, tool, and process. And we got exposed a bit, right, during the pandemic on where we had deficits in this space. So I think it's key that if you break down each area, you can find some areas of opportunity that you could bring forward sooner rather than later. And that'll help you accelerate everything else that you're working on and make you a little more resilient. So, the topic of efficiency comes up, right? And you actually have to manage your value added complexity here in a way that you're throwing your resource against the areas that are going to give us the biggest ROI when you're dealing with situations like this. So from a people perspective, we benefited significantly by going to a little more flexible and agile environment, right? We had a number of people working from home. We tried to open our offices a couple of times and we're faced with, rising cases in our area. So, when that happened, we sent everybody back home again. That actually worked to our benefit because people got a little bit of interaction when they were in here, but then when they weren't and they were back home again, they had the flexibility to work the hours we needed because supply chain certainly became 24/7 over the last year or so. And it gave them the flexibility to deal with the stuff that they had to work with at home too, right? So there were all the other factors of, you're a mom, you're a teacher, and you're a full-time employee, right? So how do you balance all those things at once? So that certainly helped us, to kick off where we were from a strategy perspective. The second piece then, if you tie to tools, so, we found our lack of data visibility disturbing, to say the least. And we're stepping up our efforts in this space now. So end user tools will make us spend more time working on the analysis and not necessarily keep punching in the data and then just seeing what's there. So as it relates to planning tools and also for RFIs and RFPs, the more we can automate here, the better repository we have for being able to build this out for the future. And then just in terms of process, these guys hit on a lot of the key things already. I would say the one I would highlight for us is actually bringing in an integrated business planning process. So that was always on our roadmap that we would do S&OP or IBP with our franchisor, with Subway Corporate. So that way we can translate their marketing plans into something that's actionable for the supply chain. Well, we've accelerated that in advance of bringing in the planning tool because we found having those conversations and talking about the trade-offs now are helping us further down the line. So, I think the moral of the story in all this is just quote Yoda, do or do not, there is no try. You got to figure it out. You're either going to learn from your failures. And if you do, fail fast, learn quickly and adapt. Or if it's working, just continue to build on it, double down on it, because you have a recipe for success there that you can leverage.
Awesome. Thanks, Scott. And I think what you commented on remote work actually segues well into our next slide, just on like returning to office, especially now as people are vaccinated and they can actually return. So as supply chain leaders continue to manage and put plans in place to protect their supply chain, what do the hiring plans look like to keep their business moving forward? Are there new job titles in demand or a need for any new skill sets to help with strategies mentioned as such as digital transformation? Will remote opportunities become the norm for the future, or will supply chain leaders need to be on site a few days of the week? Disruptions not only affect the supply chain itself, but the talent that is needed to provide solutions and strategies to protect the business. We would now like to ask our panelists, how has hiring changed for your organization in 2021? Scott, I guess to flip it back to you, would you like to start off just on, I guess it goes kind of what you were mentioning before, just on bringing people back to the office now and any other hiring landscape changes?
Yeah, absolutely. That would be great. So, as I mentioned at the beginning of this, right, supply chain is getting a lot more visibility than it ever has before. And that's a good thing because I think we're getting an injection of new blood into the supply chain and it's starting much earlier in people's careers, right? So if I think back 20 years ago, maybe supply chain was a class in some business programs. I think Ohio State was kind of a pioneer when they put logistics on the map with their marketing program. So you can get a dual major by learning a little bit about what was going on in that space, right? Today, you got programs like the University of Tennessee and Rutgers that are, top 5 supply chain management programs that are going to serve as the feeder organization more than cherry picking people from outside when it comes to entry level roles into the organization. And that workforce has different expectations, right? So there's a lot of wanting to work here and having data at your fingertips and also wanting to be able to work from wherever you're at. And if that means being remote, if you're not offering remote opportunities for your employees, somebody else is. The economy is getting better. We're losing people. Others are losing people. We're picking people up, right? So we're all fighting for the same talent that's out there. So the employee value proposition is huge right now. So you have to look at your organizational landscape and figure out what your recruiting strategy is in order to maximize it. So for us, the way it starts with is, what are those entry-level roles where we can bring people in and we can start to groom them and allow them to get some breadth and depth at the same time. So the supply chain programs are a great feeder organization for that now. We're going to continue to expand upon that. The second piece then actually ties to the people you have in-house. You have so much institutional knowledge that you could tap into, and when you think about, pillars of depth, right? Can that lend itself to actually some time in other parts of your organization so they can understand the inputs and outputs and how it feeds an end-to-end supply chain strategy? So we're doing some of those things right now with moving people around either semi-permanently or permanently, so they get exposure to, what it's like to hand something off to another part of the organization that they haven't been a part of before. And then lastly, that ties into recruiting. So it's a really competitive landscape out there right now. I think all of our teams are getting multiple phone calls over the course of a week about opportunities as businesses are bouncing back. That employee value proposition is key in order to be able to bring in the right talent. But when you bring in the right talent, you also have to make sure it's the right fit, right? So if you have this layer of the newbies coming in, right, and you have to kind of train them up and parallel them with those who have the institutional knowledge, somewhere in between, you're filling gaps, and those gaps might be subject matter experts in a particular area where you have a deficit. It might be, getting people who have breadth so you can move them around and make them more of an athlete within your supply chain organization, or maybe it's a combination of the two, right? But you have to make sure you're solving for the right issue when you're going out there and recruiting, because otherwise you're going to bring somebody in, it's not going to be the right fit, and you're going to find yourself having to do it over and over again.
Right now, and I completely agree. I think that's where video interviews have been challenging, especially if it's only one final interview. It's hard to gauge personality and culture fit, but obviously your management and your team is a big part of the reason why people do stay at a company. So 100% agree
the biggest
with you
asset you have.
Exactly.
Yep.
Awesome. So thanks for sharing that. Kevin, have you seen anything different at Aterian, or do you guys have any different strategies that you're implementing going forward?
Everything Scott mentioned is 100% correct. It's a very competitive environment right now. We're working from home, the remote working for supply chain professionals. That's very unique. Now we have professionals in the home office, but they need access to data. I'm going to go back to data and platforms. For them to operate at that maximum level, they need visibility into what the supply chain is happening. It can't just be emails and spreadsheets going back and forth. There's got to be, some a platform that could tie in different segments of the supply chain, because once they have that data, they could do what they do best and make decisions and help move that supply chain. So that's very important. In terms of people, I think the international workforce for us has been very beneficial for us. Supply chain professionals, overseas, they've been in the U.S. for some of them that we've hired, and it's been a great opportunity for us to work with folks from all over the world. The third thing that's important for me is, I come from a Lean Six Sigma background. I had a role in that when I was at Amazon, and continuous improvement thinkers. People that are naturally curious in terms of asking, okay, what is the waste here? What's the corrective action, and then what's the preventive action? That to me is, as Scott mentioned, is part of people's DNA, right? That's something that's very important, that people that think that way, I think, is a key part of being successful in the supply chain, because guess what? There's a lot of waste in supply chains. Things, once you get it squared away and put it on the path, put it on that optimal path, it'll start drifting. It's just the nature of systems. And then, you got to course correct and bring it back. And that's for people that think continuous improvement, that understand metrics and how to, look at the processes, and then, put it back to, if the data starts trending the wrong way, figure out, what's the process, and then, once again, it comes down to people too. That's the other key thing, as Scott mentioned, is at the end of the day, our workforce, the team members that we hire are the first line folks that are making the supply chain happen. So we've got to keep them happy and empower them with the right data, and then the right processes for them to, be at their best.
I guess, Kevin, too, just a question from my side, or just a client side in general. Have you seen any success from bringing in anyone directly from a data analysis background and teaching them supply chain or procurement, and having them move into a role like that? Has that been anything that you guys have tried or seen that's had success?
Yeah, we've hired folks in the past that came right out of school with a data emphasis background, and then they've learned the supply chain. In some cases we gotta also have them go spend some time in fulfillment center nodes to kind of become the expert or take their skills to the next level. But as long as they have that kind of thinking, supply chain thinking, lean thinking, and have data backgrounds, I think they could be successful in a role like this and grow into other roles in the future.
Awesome. Thank you. Jonathan, do you have anything else that you'd like to share from your side?
Yes, thank you. And Scott, thanks for acknowledging the Vols. Tennessee does have a good program. So I think three things, and I'll go fast because I know we're up against it. From a blue and a white collar perspective, if we think about skilled, unskilled, both are a challenge. For at least 2.5, 3 years now, every client I talk to, literally every single one, has an issue, whether it's with corporate office or manufacturing distribution. They have an issue. Basically, even generating demand, if you will, trying to get labor in the door. It's not just getting it, it's retaining it. And here's what I would say. On the topic of interview, I have a client who is a former partner at McKinsey, and he told me that when he was at McKinsey, they did some very in-depth, detailed analysis on the interviewing process and what was most effective. And what they found is that the one-on-one interview is by far the least effective interview that you could ever do. The most effective is a case-driven interview where the candidate talks to 3, 4, 5 people that they would be working with, and has a 2-3 hour in-depth conversation about a case, about capabilities, how they would work together, et cetera. So I think changing the hiring mindset is important. I also think for the people that are in-house already, employee engagement matters. We have a changing workforce in terms of the generation, the people that are there, what they value, what's important to them, and I think starting to educate people as to what their total comp looks like, what their total on-target earnings would be, and asking them what aspects of the benefit program are more important to them, versus others, and framing the benefits and the total package accordingly is critical. I think employee engagement, depending on the company that you're talking to, is a major issue, and for some companies at an all-time low. And so I think being creative in terms of what working arrangement you offer them versus giving them a say, if you will, almost maybe creating a budget and giving them a portfolio of benefits and letting them pick, what they want and what they don't want. Those are things that we have seen companies do, quite successfully. Alternative staffing models as well. I think alternative staffing models are critical. We're seeing more organizations build relationships with colleges, with universities, that are even being more creative on, one of the things that I absolutely admire, a company here in Charlotte where I live has said, we will take people who are prior offenders who may have a criminal record where they may not have done that in the past. And so they're working with some of the local agencies that have people who are struggling to get back in the workplace because of a mistake they may have made at some point in their lives, and willing to try to work with that. And so I think that matters as well. I think the other thing, though, is really thinking about strategic investments in automation. A Bank of America survey, Bank of America Security survey from last year, early 2020, found that when surveyed, a number of C-suite respondents expressed a desire to increase their investment in automation exponentially over the next 3 to 5 years. We're already seeing that in terms of demands for automation and artificial intelligence and some of the different capabilities that can be used. I think they're never a replacement in their entirety for good labor, but I think they're important, and I think they have to be considered. And I think that has to be a part of at least a part of the discussion is, how do we do a better job of attracting and retaining talent, but also, where does it make the most sense to invest in automation? And so I think that's a part of it as well.
Awesome. And that's interesting. I think we've definitely seen, I think, every interview format at this point, but I know almost like a mix of the case study and the one-on-ones is something that candidates have mentioned that they really love and think is effective, just because they get that mix of the one-on-one personal interaction where the client can sell them into the opportunity, but then on the reverse side, the client can see them acting and thinking as if they already have the job. So I definitely agree. I think that's an interesting interview format and something that definitely works and is successful. Before we dive into our Q&A session, we'd like to thank all of you guys for being here, Jonathan, Scott, and Kevin, for an insightful discussion on our topic, looking forward how companies are future-proofing the supply chain. It's so interesting to hear how different organizations are dealing with similar issues and using similar solutions. DSJ Global remains committed to help our clients navigate these challenges, to prepare for the future, and our long-term partnership with organizations when it comes to talent acquisition and end-to-end supply chain. If you have any questions on our research or on our services, you can reach out to me directly through my email on the screen. So now we have about 10 minutes left to go through the questions for our panelists that were submitted before time or were sent in the chat. We'll try and get through as many as possible that we can. Our first question from the audience is, what steps are you taking in this inflationary environment to contain costs and preserve margin? How do you evaluate and measure that? Kevin, would you like to answer that question?
Sure, that's a really good question. As we all know, with the cost of transportation and importing, that product that's sitting in our warehouse, it may, we may have spent 50, 100% X or more than prior. So it's it's definitely inflationary times in terms of what will become available, especially in the e-commerce environment. So that being said, what we're able to do well at Aterian is that with our data, we're very quickly able to evaluate the SKU profitability, and in some cases, in this current condition, we've decided not to sell certain SKUs because we have a lean supply chain. Our turnaround time from the factories in China is 3 to 5 months. So based on our data earlier in the year, some SKUs, just isn't profitable for us to sell anymore. A big part of that for e-commerce companies is the last mile. If you think about, the increases in parcel costs that companies like UPS and FedEx have implemented in the last, year, it's astounding, in terms of peak surcharges, the removal of discounts, increases in everything, all segments, residential surcharge, et cetera, et cetera. So what used to cost me, let's say $30 to deliver to a customer, a large package, now costs over $100. There's that kind of a margin erosion is very, very it's something that you can't recover from very quickly. So so for us, we're able to pivot away from SKUs that are not now in this condition unprofitable, and pivot into SKUs that are profitable. So the data helps us do that. In larger companies where you may not get that information until end of the quarter or much over a longer period of time. By the time you make that decision, it may be too late. But for us, it's been very beneficial. And then lastly, one way to preserve margin, going back to the last mile, then this is very pragmatic experience for a lot of folks, is that putting the inventory closer to the customer will reduce that last mile cost. But it also means you have to spend money to get it there. And then in the past year, there's been some really good competition for FedEx and UPS from companies. I'll give an example. OnTrack has just been outstanding in the West in terms of hitting the UPS kind of performance at a much lower cost by servicing a smaller part of the country and being more efficient at it. So there are players out there, which I talked about earlier in terms of redundancies that, especially if you're in e-commerce, you got to look at all those segments because they're out there, but you got to get your foot in the door early because everyone else is knocking at their doors. So building those relationships, creating the conversations early is very important.
Awesome. Thanks, Kevin. Our next question I have for you, Scott. Due to the pandemic and lockdowns, the supplies have restricted from suppliers and manufacturers for different categories. They have increased the price as well as due to increase in cost. The companies are now focusing on how to reduce supply chain and procurement costs. The question for you is, what are the best options available to minimize the cost in the current situation?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think it's a combination of things that Kevin, Jonathan, and I have alluded to, over the course of this panel discussion, right? So the first thing is you're going to have a strategy that you were working on already for your supply chain. There's got to be low-hanging fruit there that you can start to pull forward. So if you already had cost-saving initiatives, I don't know of a supply chain that doesn't have cost-saving initiatives. The opportunity is to try to pull some of that forward as quickly as possible. Small wins will make a bigger difference in the long run. So it doesn't have to be boiling the ocean. It could be something small that just starts a springboard of opportunities from a continuous improvement perspective. That being said, there are some practical things you could do depending upon the industry you're in, and these guys hit it on already. So whether it's supplier consolidation, if it's moving the inventory closer to the end user, or if it's reducing the number of SKUs that you have available. All of those are going to eliminate some complexity in the cost of doing business. They also have ramifications, right? So you just have to know for your industry what those trade-offs are. For Subway, we can eliminate some of our SKUs that are out there, but if we start getting into the bread and butter of what we do, I think people would be pretty disappointed if they walked in and we didn't have it when they were walking into a restaurant. So it's a very calculated decision when we do it. Do we need 3 different kind of peppers? No, maybe we can go with 2, right? So it's looking at opportunities like that to help reduce complexity, and in turn, your costs will go down. It's 1 less slot in the warehouse and 1 less case you have to move through the supply chain.
Awesome. Thanks, Scott. Another question which just came through: how are you leveraging your available supply chain data to either make adaptive or proactive moves in an otherwise highly volatile demand world? Is there anyone who'd like to take that one?
Yeah, sure. I'd love to take that. I think data's gold. What would be the first thing that I would say? I think from a demand perspective, the closer you can get to the demand signal and understanding, if you're a multi-channel business, for example, where you're selling through multiple channels, where do you believe demand will originate? Understanding that not all products can be forecasted. One of the number 1 mistakes I see companies make is they put technology in and they think, great, I'm done. That's going to generate my baseline statistical forecast. I'm going to add some intelligence to it and we're good to go. That is a recipe for failure, because not every product can be forecasted. There's not enough data to forecast it. And so I think a forecastability index is critical to being able to identify, which products can you truly forecast versus which ones need to be either, make to order or made on a min-max basis. There are other strategies that can be used. And so I think that is important. I think the other thing, understanding your supplier's ability to perform. And that gets back to the supply chain risk management angle, which I think is so important. And there's good products out there. Interos is one of my favorites. They have an incredible solution that lets you identify, where you have risk in your supply chain with your suppliers and even your suppliers that could ultimately impact your ability to negatively satisfy demand. And so I think, my response would be very simple, understand and manage the demand signal appropriately, and then also to utilize the right technology to understand where you have risk so that you can take steps to mitigate.
Awesome. Thanks, Jonathan. And I know we're wrapping up on time, so this is going to wrap up our panel discussion. Thank you so much to everyone who joined today. We will send out an email with the recording, and feel free, of course, to contact us with any questions or inquiries. We hope you found today's